before this COVID thing, you and Bret had some good conversations. I would say we're friends. What do you admire most about Bret outside of all the criticism we've had about this COVID topic?
Well, I think Brett is very smart, and he's a very ethical person who wants good things for the world. I mean, I have no reason to doubt that. So the fact that we're crosswise on this issue does not mean that I think he's a bad person. I mean, the thing that worried me about what he was doing, and this was true of Joe, and this was true of Elon, this is true of many other people, is that once you're messaging at scale to a vast audience, you incur a certain kind of responsibility not to get people killed. And I did worry that, yeah, people were making decisions on the basis of the information that was getting shared there. And that's why I think, fairly circumspect. I just said, okay, give me the center of the fairway expert opinion at this time point, and at this time point, and at this time point, and then I'm out. Right? I don't have any more to say about this. I'm not an expert on COVID. I'm not an expert on the safety of mRNA vaccines. If something changes so as to become newsworthy, then maybe I'll do a podcast. So, I mean, I just did a podcast on the lab leak, right?
Leak.
I was never skeptical of the lab leak hypothesis. Bret was very early on saying this is a lab leak, right? At a point where my only position was, who cares if it's a lab leak, right? Like there's the thing we have to get straight is, what do we do given the nature of this pandemic?
But also, we should say that you've actually stated that it is a possibility.
Oh yeah,
you just said it doesn't quite matter.
I mean, the time to figure that out. Now, I have had my podcast guest on this topic changed my view of this, because one of the guests, Alina Chan, made the point that no, actually the best time to figure out the origin of this is immediately, right?
Yeah.
Because in the you lose touch with the evidence. And I hadn't really been thinking about that. Like if you come back after a year, there are certain facts you might not be able to get in hand. But I've always felt that it didn't matter for two reasons. One is we had the genome of the virus, and we were very quickly immediately designing vaccines against that genome. And that's what we had to do. And then we had to figure out how to vaccinate and to mitigate and to develop treatments and all of that. So the origin story didn't matter. Generically speaking, either origin story was politically inflammatory and made the Chinese look bad, right? And the Chinese response to this looked bad, whatever the origin story, right? They're not cooperating. They're stopping their domestic flights, but letting their international flights go. I mean, it's just, they were bad actors, and they should be treated as such regardless of the origin, right? And I would argue that the wet market origin is even more politically invidious than the lab leak origin. I mean,
why do you think?
Because for the lab leak, to my eye, the lab leak could happen to anyone, right? All these advanced countries are running these dangerous labs. That's a practice that we should be worried about, in general. We know lab leaks are a problem. There have been multiple lab leaks of even worse things, but that haven't gotten out of hand in this way, but, worse pathogens. We're wise to be worried about this. And on some level, it could happen to anyone, right? The wet market makes them look like barbarians living in another century. Like, you got to clean up those wet markets. Like, what are you doing putting a bat on top of a pangolin, on top of a duck? It's like, get your shit together. So, like, if anything, the wet market makes them look worse, in my view. Now, I'm sure that what they actually did to conceal a lab leak, if it was a lab leak, I mean, all of that's going to look odious.
Do you think we'll ever get to the bottom of that? I mean, one of the big negative, I would say, failures of Anthony Fauci and so on is to be transparent and clear and just a good communicator about gain and function research. The dangers of that, the success, why it's a useful way of research, but it's also dangerous.
Right.
Just being transparent about that, as opposed to just coming off really shady. Of course, the conspiracy theorists and the politicians are not helping. but this just
Yeah.
created a giant mess.
Yeah, no, I would agree that so that exchange with Fauci and Rand Paul that went viral. Yeah, I would agree that Fauci looked like he was taking refuge in kind of very lawyered
Yeah.
language and not giving a straightforward account of what we do and why we do it. And so, yeah, I think it looked shady, it played shady, and it probably was shady. I mean, I don't know how personally entangled he is with any of this, but yeah, the gain of function research is something that I think we're wise to be worried about. And insofar as I judge myself adequate to have an opinion on this, I think it should be banned, right? Like I'm probably a podcast I'll do, if you or somebody else doesn't do it in the meantime. Um, I would like a virologist on to defend it against a virologist who would criticize it. Forget about just the gain of function research. I don't even understand virus hunting at this point.
Hmm.
It's like I don't know. I don't even know why you need to go into a cave to find this next virus that could be circulating among bats that may jump zoonotically to us. Why do that when we can when we can sequence in a day and make vaccines in a weekend? I mean,
Yeah.
like what
Well,
what
that's
kind
a
of head
surprise.
start do you think you're getting?
That's a surprising new thing. How quickly
Yeah,
you can develop a vaccine.
exactly.
That's yeah, that's really interesting. But the shadiness around lab leak.
I think the point I didn't make about Bret's style of engaging this issue is people are using the fact that he was early on lab leak to suggest that he was right about ivermectin and about mRNA vaccines and all the rest. Like, no, that's none of that connects. And it was possible to be falsely confident. Like, you shouldn't have been confident about lab. No one should have been confident about lab leak early, even if it turns out to be lab leak. Right? It was always plausible. It was never definite. It still isn't definite. Zoonotic is also quite plausible. It certainly was super plausible then. Both are politically uncomfortable. Both at the time were inflammatory to be banging on about when we were trying to secure some kind of cooperation from the Chinese, right? So there's a time for these things, and it's possible to be right by accident, right? That's that is your reasoning. The style of reasoning matters whether you're right or not. It's like because your style of reasoning is dictating what you're going to do on the next topic.
Sure, but this is this multivariate situation here. It's really difficult to know what's right on COVID, given all the uncertainty, all the chaos, especially when you step outside the pure biology, virology of it, and you start getting to policy.
Hmm.
It's,
Yeah,
it's really
yeah. There's just trade-offs. Yeah.
like transmissibility of the virus. Sure, just knowing if 65% of the population gets vaccinated, what effect would that have? Just even knowing those things, just modeling all those things. Um, Given all the other incentives, I mean, Pfizer,
But
I don't know what to
you
think.
had the CEO of Pfizer on your podcast. Did you leave that conversation feeling like this is a person who is consciously uh, reaping windfall profits on a dangerous vaccine and putting everyone at intolerable risk? Or do you think this person? Did you think this person was making a good faith attempt to save lives and had no taint of bad incentives or something between?
The thing I sensed, and I felt in part, it was a failure on my part, but I sensed that I was talking to a politician.
Hmm.
So it's not thinking of there was malevolence there or benevolence. There was
He just had a job to
he
do.
put on a suit, and I was talking to a suit, not a
Hmm.
human being. Now he said that his son was a big fan of the podcast, which is why he wanted to do it. So I
Right.
thought I would be talking to a human being, and I asked challenging questions, but I thought the internet thinks otherwise. Every single question in that interview was a challenging one.
Hmm.
but it wasn't grilling, which is what people seem to want to do with pharmaceutical companies. There's a deep distrust of pharmaceutical companies.
But what's the alternative? I mean, I totally get
Right. That's
that
just a
windfall
quick.
profits at a time of a public health emergency
Yeah.
looks bad. It is a bad look, right?
Yep.
But
Yep.
how do we reward and return capital to risk takers who will spend $1 billion to design a new drug for a disease that maybe only harms a single digit percentage of the population. It's like, well, what do we want to encourage, and who do we want to get rich? I mean, so like the person who cures cancer, do we want that person to get rich or not? We want the person who gave us the iPhone to get rich, but we don't want the person who cures cancer to get rich. I mean, what are we
I
trying to
think it's a
do?
very gray area. So what we want is the person who declares that they have a cure for cancer to have authenticity and transparency. There's like, I think we're good now as a population smelling bullshit. And there is something about the Pfizer CEO, for example, just CEOs of pharmaceutical
Mm,
companies in general, just because they're so lawyered up, so much marketing
yeah,
PR people that you just smell bullshit. You're not talking to a real human. That it just feels like none of it is transparent to us as a public. So like this whole talking point that Pfizer's only interested in helping people just doesn't ring true, even though it very well could be true. It's the same thing with Bill Gates,
mm,
who seems to be at scale helping a huge amount of people in the world.
yeah,
And yet there's something about the way he delivers that message where people like, these seem suspicious. What's happening underneath this?
right.
There's certain kinds of communication styles that seem to be more serve as better catalysts for conspiracy theories. And I'm not sure what that is because I don't think there's an alternative for capitalism in delivering drugs that help people. But also at the same time, there seems to need to be more transparency. And plus, like regulation that actually makes sense versus
Mm.
it seems like pharmaceutical companies are susceptible to corruption.
Yeah, I worry about all that, but I also do think that most of the people going into those fields and most of the people going
Yes.
into government
Yeah. They want to do
are
good.
doing it for good, and they're non-psychopaths trying to get good things done and trying to solve hard problems, and they're not trying to get rich. I mean, many of the people are. It's like they're. I mean, bad incentives are something. Again, I've uttered that phrase 30 times
Yeah.
on this podcast, but it's just almost everywhere it explains normal people creating terrible harm. Right? It's not that there are that many bad people, and uh, yes, it makes the truly bad people that much more remarkable and worth paying attention to. But the bad incentives and the bad the the power of bad ideas do much more harm, because I mean that's what gets good people running in the wrong direction, or doing things that are clearly creating unnecessary suffering.